inform everyone that I'm recording this presentation. So I'd like to welcome you everyone to the special seminar by Professor Robert Root-Bernstein. If you'll allow me just to say one or few words by virtue of introduction. I'd like to welcome Professor Anthony Jacoby, who's the Kritzer Distinguished Professor and Head of the Department of Mechanical Science and Engineering. Good morning, Tony. Thank you for joining us. Professor Tahir Saif, who's in charge of the departmental seminar committee, amongst many others. Thank you for allowing this seminar to take place. I'd like to welcome all UIUC faculty, staff, students, and alumni. And then a special word of welcome also to the Engagement in Engineering Education, or as we call it, the ENGINE team. It's wonderful to be one of your colleagues. I learn a lot from you. And thank you also to Dr. Jay Mann, the Director of the Academy for Excellence in Engineering Education, who funds this program, and it's co-funded by the Department of Mechanical Engineering. Thank you very much for your support. We have some cross-disciplinary guests from all over the show. Professor David Ratcliffe from Purdue University, Professor Jenny Case from Virginia Tech, Professor Helene Donis-Keller from Olin College, Professor Neri Oxman from MIT Media Lab, Professor Bonnie Cremont from the University of Georgia, Professor Piotr Jagodzinski from the University of Alberta, and Professor Santi Zabala, who's joining us from Spain. Santi, thank you very much for your interest, and we're looking forward to your interaction as well today. Ladies and gentlemen, according to the academies, the national academies, the universities have been changing. We're changing the way we're doing things. We're trying to adapt to students constantly and industries constantly changing needs, or the real world out there. So instead of just doing things better, it appears that, you know, many universities have been attempting to do better things. But I guess to become truly transformative, we really need to see things differently. And a person who's been practicing this for a really, really long time is Professor Bob Root-Bernstein. Professor Root-Bernstein is a professor of physiology at Michigan State University. He earned his bachelor's degree in biochemistry and his doctoral degree in the history of science, both at Princeton University. And then he did his postdoctoral research with the famous Dr. Jonas Salk. He received one of the first MacArthur or Genius Fellowships in 1981. He has published over 200 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters ranging from, as you can see on the screen, from the books that he's written, ranging from autoimmune disease research, the physiology of receptor systems and drug discovery, to creativity studies and interactions between sciences and the arts. He's published 4 books, 2 in collaboration with his wife, Michelle. And the most important 2 books pertaining to today's discussion or presentation is the one called, and you see it on your screen lower left, Discovering, Inventing and Solving Problems at the Frontiers of Knowledge. And a book which I have, which is called Sparks of Genius, the 13 Thinking Tools of the World's Most Creative People. You see the picture of the front cover on your screen as well. So Bob is a practicing artist as well. His piece, Rebiogenesis, in collaboration with the transmedia artist Adam Brown. Now you see that in the center top image. So that work of art functions simultaneously as an art installation and a working origins of life experiment. It's been exhibited around the world. It was recently acquired by a new science art museum in Porto, Portugal, as part of their permanent collection. Ladies and gentlemen, I can carry on for a long, long time to introduce our speaker, but with this very short introduction, please welcome, it's my privilege and honor to welcome Professor Robert Root-Bernstein. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. So you've already got me up there. All right. So thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. I very much appreciate it. And I hope I can give you some interesting insights into science, art, and education. Oh, I don't seem to have control of this. Where are we?
Bob, whilst you just getting your presentation ready, if I may ask the participants, you're most welcome during the talk to post your questions in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. I'll collect them. But I'd like to ask you if you wouldn't mind posing your questions at the end of the presentation, please. That would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, so you can see my first slide?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it's not moving forward, which is not good.
Bob, we've got 5 people from the Center for Innovation and Teaching and Learning. I wonder if you could offer some insights. David, Chilan, experts in PowerPoint.
How about I'll stop sharing and try this again. Share screen, we'll try the other one.
I get that sometimes. I usually put my mouse over the PD or the.
Okay, I got it. We just reloaded it.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay, sorry for the delay here. I want to start with a few assumptions because I think we get those up and get them out in front, then we're in good shape when I start questioning them. Often held educational assumptions are things like we should train for expertise, focusing on skills and techniques of obvious utility, and that specialization is essential to success. I'm going to question all of these as we go forward. And in fact, I'm even going to question whether all of our education should be practical. So one of the reasons I'm doing this is something that Leon already mentioned. Our whole education system and the reason for having it is changing rather rapidly. The basic idea of the university was founded, many centuries ago and hasn't changed all that much in the last century, although we are moving from an industrial economy to a knowledge economy in which innovation and knowledge become the major things rather than somebody doing a repetitive job over and over again in an industrial setting. So what's been happening is that employers are changing what they're looking for. Recent studies by IBM, the Conference Board, and lots of other people have all found that at the very top of employers' lists across a huge range of different professions, there are 3 things that keep showing up, and these are creativity, innovation, and flexibility. The biggest problem that these reviews have found, however, is that educators tend to think about these terms in very different ways than the employers do. Educators tend to think about creativity and innovation as problem-solving skills, whereas employers almost universally define it as problem identification or articulation. That raises a really big problem for us because most people don't teach problem identification or articulation at all in any curriculum. An additional problem is that psychologists define creativity and innovation in yet another way, and I'll get a little bit more into that later in the talk. But one of the interesting things is that the term flexibility, which the employers are also looking for, is highly related to creativity and innovation from the perspective of psychology. So I'll talk more about that as we go forward. So how are we going to define these terms? One of the things that my wife and I have been doing is trying to think about these not as a adjective or a trait that a person has, but as processes that are learnable. And that means thinking about creating as inventing, recognizing, and reformulating problems or challenges in such a way that it makes them amenable to resolution in a new and effective manner. Innovating then becomes the process of transforming a creative solution into a successful workplace operating procedure or some type of invention, for example. I've shown the picture on the right-hand side here to sort of emphasize that you can be highly creative but not innovative. This is a Japanese invention to allow men to feed their babies. I strongly suspect that although it's highly creative, it's not going to be innovative in the sense of making it in the marketplace. And that means that, in a sense, they've solved the wrong problem. So, why is redefining, creating, and innovating important? Basically, because it shifts the whole idea of what we're trying to teach from trying to select out people who have certain traits or talents to actually training them in particular skills. It shifts from problem solving to problem finding. It shifts from novelty for its own sake to applied results, which means it's going to be very real world, even though I'm going to talk about being not very worldly at the same time. It shifts from specialization to exploratory, combining, and synthesizing, because anything that's creative is taking two or more elements that haven't been put together before and now putting them together in a new and effective way. And then we have to stop thinking about finding prodigies to actually training polymaths. And we actually believe that it is possible to train polymaths who are highly creative. All right, more corollaries to redefining creating. What this is going to do is shift us to looking at the problems. As I said, raising problems does something really interesting, and that is to define and bound the set of possible solutions. So in this sense, in a colloquial term, it creates a box. And this box does a number of things. One is that it defines who's going to be able to fit in the box and work within those constraints. It sets a set of constraints that determine what the problem solutions can be. And that means that what we need to do in education is figure out how to devise an education that creates boxes of multiple dimensions and many different sizes and shapes, so as many different kinds of problems as possible can be addressed. So we need different kinds of boxes than just the standard, here are the solutions to problems we already know. And we need to be able to teach students how to fit into boxes in a flexible way. So how do we pass this knowledge on that we've had for years and years, which clearly is one of the things that we need to do as educators. We need to keep our traditions, but at the same time, provide a unique and flexible education that allows people to adapt to a future which most of us can't even foresee at this point. All right, so that's the big problem. How am I going to go about addressing this? So here's an outline of what I'm going to do for the rest of my talk. And that is to begin by taking lessons for the best creators and innovators. I'm going to give you a series of exemplars. I'm going to draw out some conclusions from these exemplars in terms of how they were educated and what they can teach us about how to educate better. And that will then lead me to the conclusion that we need to shape idiosyncratic innovators, not turn out robotic replicas who are all trained in exactly the same way, which is pretty much what our current education system does. In order to then train differently or think differently, we're going to have to train differently and more broadly. And I'm going to give you both anecdotal and statistical studies to back this up. And then we have to focus now on teaching the creative process as one of the key ways in which we can train people in this flexible thinking and problem generation. We also need to think about what I call tools for thinking. These are general ways of posing problems and grappling with them, which are transdisciplinary across all different types of professions. I'll focus mainly on science and art here, but you should realize that they can be applied elsewhere. And then in conclusion, I'm going to talk about what I call a Y-shaped student, which would be the restructuring of higher education. So think differently to be different and create different things. You have to train differently in order to do that. And so let me start with some case studies. I'm only going to give you probably less than a dozen. And I just want to mention that we have actually done about 200 or 300 of them at this point. So these are highly selected. I'm going to focus, as I said, on arts and crafts in science and engineering, medicine training, but you should again realize that I could do this with humanities, social sciences, any mixture that you want to think about. All right, so my first example is Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1906 for his neuroanatomical studies of the structure of the central nervous system. And one of the questions is, how did he do this? Why was it him rather than somebody else? He was a phenomenal photographer. The painting on the left here is something he did when he was 17 years old. He and his father actually started a anatomical atlas, and Cajal did all of the paintings himself, so he was an extremely good observer. The painting in the middle is something he did simply for his own pleasure. That's not a photograph, that's actually a highly realistic painting. And Ramon Cajal, which is most important for his science, was also one of the first color photographers in all of Spain. He set up the first laboratory for producing color photographs. He actually would come in and pay him to use the laboratory and so forth. What this did was to give him tremendous understanding of silver dyes and things like that, which is what he actually used to trace out the neurons in the central nervous system. So there's a direct connection there. Alexis Carrel, Nobel Prize winner, 1912, for developing new suturing methods. These methods made it possible for people for the first time to actually start considering things like organ transplants or taking care of aneurysms, all of which had been completely deadly before that. Again, very interesting background. He formally trained in lace making and embroidery with, among other people, Marie-Anne Leroudier, who was one of the most famous tapestry makers and embroiderers of her in the world at the time. And if you look at the methods that Carrel employed, they used the same tools. They actually pulled using the same techniques you make in lace making. He adapted the embroidery needles and so forth and so on, the actual threads directly to surgery, and this completely transformed major surgeries for the rest of the century. Carrel's innovations then made possible lots of other innovations. So the first heart surgery was performed in 1952 by Lasker Award winners Alfred Blalock and Helen Taussig. And what they were working on is something called blue baby syndrome. Taussig had actually discovered the anatomical causes of this. What happens is there are holes in the baby's heart, as well as misdirection of the, or blockages of the blood flow into the various veins and arteries, creating a huge problem in oxygenating the blood. As a result, the babies actually turn or look blue, and it was essentially 100% fatal. So Taussig convinced Blalock that they should go ahead and try these surgeries. No one had carried out a successful heart surgery before that. Every patient died. However, the backstory here is how they were successful is that there is a African-American man named Vivian Thomas, who in fact never even went to college, who developed all of the techniques that were used during the successful surgeries. He was a master carpenter. During 1929, he lost all of his savings. He had hoped to go to medical school, could not. Got a job with Blaylock, literally cleaning out the animal cages and things like that, but soon convinced Blaylock that he had lots of other talents. Among those where he actually invented the animal model by which they practiced the blue baby surgeries, the surgical tools, and most of the surgical techniques. And he stood behind Blaylock, actually coaching him through the first dozen surgeries. So here we have a man whose major training was completely outside of medicine, who completely transformed medicine. There continue to be interesting innovations in medicine by doing these odd mixtures of talents. Dr. Franz Freudenthal has been dealing with blue baby syndrome in Bolivia and Peruvian children. It's a slightly less complicated version in which there's a hole in the heart without all of the other complications. It turns out that all of us are born with a hole in the heart, which normally seals itself up in the first couple of days after birth. But in Peru and Bolivia, this doesn't happen. So they need to go in and put something that will block that hole. These are called occluders. But in Bolivia and Peru, they don't have a way of manufacturing these in the way that's necessary, in unique size and shape for each individual child. So Freudenthal actually managed to show the local women how to knit them. So these are all hand knit occluders. This kind of approach to surgery has been taken into the engineering realm by fabric engineer Ellis in England. And what he does is he now programs major machines to make bespoke surgical implants for anything that you can imagine. They're embroidered because they're much stronger in every direction than our normal tissues or surgical techniques used by other surgeons. Another example, Alexander Fleming. Probably everybody knows that he's the discoverer of penicillin. A penicillium colony supposedly dropped into his staphylococci plate, killing off the staphylococci, and eureka, he had discovered penicillin. Turns out it's not quite that simple. Again, he had a very odd background. His hobby was painting. We have to give him a little bit of laxity here. He doesn't look like he's very good, and he's not, but all of these paintings were done on agar plates with bacteria. This is not written with ink, but with bacteria developing colors. So what he would do is he would play. He would take his Petri dishes when he finished any experiment. He would open them up, allow any bacterium or fungus or anything else that was around to fall on them. And this is how he developed his microbacterial palette for his paintings. He'd been doing this for about 17 years by the time penicillin dropped onto his plate. So he had a very good idea of which bacteria and other things could grow together and which couldn't. And when he saw what happened with the penicillin, he was very well prepared to realize how very, very important it was. Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin, Nobel Prize winner in 1964. I decided to use this image just to remind you how far and how difficult it has been for women to come as scientists. British wife wins Nobel Prize, yes. Well, so Hodgkin was, interestingly, for an X-ray crystallographer, not very good at math, but she was an incredibly good visualizer. So she would be able to take the kinds of data you see on the left-hand side here and see literally in her mind the three-dimensional shapes of the molecules that they represented. This is no mean feat. So how did she do this? Well, she had a very interesting background. She was homeschooled. Her parents were both archaeologists. They took her out in the field with her from the time she was a little girl. She had to write about and draw or paint everything that she learned, whether it was history, botany, you name it, crystallography. The painting on the right-hand side there was done when she was 17 for a professional illustration of one of her parents' archaeological publications. So she was extremely talented. When she got to working with insulin, which is one of the proteins she solved the structure of to win the Nobel Prize, she actually painted on the left-hand side the data because it was so beautiful, and could then transform it into three-dimensional models on the right-hand side because of this wonderful three-dimensional imagination that she had developed. Similar background for Harold Kroto, Nobel Prize winner 1996 for discovering Buckminster fullerenes. These are carbon-60 compounds that form these nice cages which look very much like a Buckminster Fuller geodesic dome. And I've shown the biosphere here from the Montreal Expo in 1967 because Kroto actually went to see that, and it inspired him to continue what he had been doing for many years, which was to be a part-time designer and artist. The painting on the left-hand side is a self-portrait at age 12. Throughout his career, even while he was doing his Nobel Prize-winning work, he spent about half his time as a designer for various other people, and won book design, book cover design contests, all sorts of crazy things like that. He literally, throughout his career, could not decide whether he wanted to be an artist or designer or a chemist. And at one point, he actually applied to Buckminster Fuller's atelier to work with him. So he had the knowledge of these compounds in his head, the structures which he needed when he did his chemistry. I'll just mention briefly that there is art embedded on all sorts of different things that we take for granted. The computer chip is a product of the arts. What a designer has to be able to do is take a series of logical operations, imagine the electrons moving from one part of a chip to another as a series of patterns. He has to translate those patterns into images. Those images are then used to block out the way the electrons will flow through a logic process, and they're made into large silk screens, which are often several feet on a side. These are then shrunk by photographic techniques, and then photolithography and etching are used to actually make the chips. Every single one of these techniques is an artistic technique that has been around for centuries. Moving on with the idea of the chip as an exemplar, we have them in our phones, and one of the interesting problems that needed to be solved in order for all of us to use millions of phones simultaneously is how we can actually spread out the spectrum of usable frequencies that are available. And there have been two solutions which also allow us to encrypt our information at the same time. These are frequency hopping and direct sequencing, both of which came out of musicians as their inventions. Again, a well-known example is the frequency hopping invented by actress Hedy Lamarr and composer George Antheil, who basically realized that you could take any message, and by, in a sense, moving it up and down the piano, you move the frequency continuously. Nobody knows when you're sending a message at what frequency, and therefore it's almost impossible to block. And like music, you can therefore send all sorts of encrypted information. Same thing with Joseph Schillinger with direct sequencing. There is no good history of this one. I happened to stumble on the invention by accident. But basically, Schillinger was a music theoretician and artist and inventor. He taught music theory to people like George Gershwin, Burt Bacharach, Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, lots of other people. invented two of the first electronic instruments, the rhythmicon and the kaleidophone, and he composed the first music for the theremin. He also wrote books about the mathematics of art and music. And one of the really interesting concepts he came up with was how to teach people how to think about complex rhythms. So in the red circle there are some of his illustrations of how you take, for example, a 2-on-3 or a 3-on-4 rhythm and combine them. And if you look at the very bottom row there, he's taken the two rows above them and added them together. And so what you hear with a 2-on-3 or a 3-on-4 is something completely different. So he's basically digitized the concept of a rhythm and then added them together to create this very strange pattern. Well, it turns out that if you wanted to send a message on the left-hand side on the top, and it's a digital message made of a series of zeros and ones, you can then add that to a randomized set of zeros and ones, and they will add in exactly the same way that Schillinger used his syncopation patterns. And then all you have to do is give the person at the other side the same random thing. He can subtract it out and get the message out. Otherwise, you just have this random set of noises and patterns that make no sense. The person who actually implemented this was, again, somebody with dual training, the composer and mathematician Milton Babbitt, who taught both subjects at Princeton University, and during World War II was basically employed by what became the National Security Agency, and for the rest of his life was unable to talk about that work because we still use it. It's still very important work. All right, so here, that was a series of very interesting, but anecdotal examples. It's easy to pick a few examples, but is this typical of people who are creative? That's a question that we used to get all the time. So we ended up doing lots of statistical studies. Now, it turns out that I'm certainly not the first person to have come upon this idea that creativity in science and medicine, engineering requires some kind of interest in other kinds of creativity as well. The first Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, J.H. Van Hoff, actually gave a talk in 1878 called Imagination in Science, where he said he'd read about 200 or 300 scientific biographies and discovered that the most imaginative scientists also had artistic avocations. There's a huge literature on this ever since. R.K. White's Versatility of Genius in 1931 is a real classic. I really like Paul Cranfield, who was a historian of science, who looked at the philosophical and cultural interests of the biophysical movement of 1847. People like Helmholtz and Dubois-Reymond, who did very, very important work and found a direct correlation between the number of different interests they had and the number of major discoveries they made. And there have been much more recent ones, for example, Simonton and Cassandro, who looked at thousands of different people and basically found good correlations between versatility, openness to new experiences, and the diversity of creative products that people make. Our work has focused a lot on Nobel Prize winners and people in the national academies. So we found that Nobel Prize winners have about 3 times as many adult avocations as the average person and about twice as many as the people in the Royal Society or the National Academy of Sciences. And the same thing is true of National Academy engineers. They are about twice as likely, sometimes 3 times as likely to be craftsmen, photographers, to draw and paint, play music, and so forth as adults while they're actually doing their professional work than the typical individual. When we looked at the Nobel Prize winners in the sciences, particularly striking was that they were 15 to 25 times more likely than the average scientist or even the average individual in our society to engage in crafts, particularly visual arts, creative writing, and performing. So this really sets them off from everybody else. And again, I emphasize they're doing this not only from when they were children and adolescents, but into their adult years. That's all nice, but does it actually impact what they're doing? So, for example, on the left-hand side here, we looked at National Academy of Engineering members. So these are all very, very highly successful individuals, and simply looked at those who had 0 to 5 patents versus those that had more than 5 patents. As you can see, the more patents people had, the more likely they were to have arts, crafts, music, avocations, or direct training. And on the right-hand side, we did another study. This was looking at Michigan engineers. So these are mainly from the University of Michigan and Michigan State University. And we compared them to people who got Michigan Economic Development Corporation funding. So these were from the same basic population, but these were people who actually founded new companies. So again, the people who founded companies who had patents and then were entrepreneurial on top of it were, again, as you can see with the stars, much more likely to be engaged in ceramics, dancing, metalwork, mechanics, painting, and so forth and so on. So simple summary here of what we've been finding is the creative polymaths tend to wear many hats. They're able to shift between them. And the basic reasons for this, we think, are that the more understanding you have of the more different techniques and subjects, the more different kinds of interesting and important challenges you can identify, and the more important questions you can ask. And then, of course, after that, you have the knowledge to imagine a broader set of solutions than the average person. So getting back to my box analogy, the more boxes you can fit into, and the bigger your box is. We also have done sort of less statistical studies, but we asked all the people in our studies whether they would recommend arts and crafts education as being useful or even essential for scientific and engineering innovators. And you can see here that 80% of them either said yes or certainly or some version of those words, about 14% maybe, and only 5.6% said no. Here are the kinds of responses we got. Yes, because it's relaxing and frees the mind. Dancing, playing on the playground helps one get a visceral feeling for physics. Hands-on experience with tools and materials is important for practical problem solving. It allows you to explore materials in a different way. Anybody who's actually made things knows if you don't understand materials viscerally, then you probably are going to have problems making something. Mechanical skills are being taught, pattern visualization. These are developed by arts and crafts and so forth. Last one, yes, it helps creativity. All right, so the people we've been looking at are very clear that they see that there are connections. And this is very important because one of the things that our education tends to do is to train experts and then give them a liberal arts education. That liberal arts education can have many strands, as at the top here, but the strands never actually integrate in any particular way. The people who we've been studying are very clear that everything that they do integrates, and they find ways to weave them together. So again, it turns out that this is nothing new. John Dewey said this in Art and Experience in 1934. Gerald Holton, who's a historian of science, talked about it in Understanding Scientific Genius. Howard Gruber makes a big point of this in Darwin and Man, calling it networks of enterprise. I thought I'd discovered it in 1989, only discovered these other guys afterwards. So basically what we think is going on here is people who are highly creative create integrated networks of enterprise. They try to learn from everything they do and integrate it into everything else. Just a couple more examples from some of the people that goes into a little bit more depth. Stephanie Kwolek, who was the designer who invented Kevlar, started out wanting to be a fashion designer. And this trained her eye to observe. She would visualize the product and so forth. And she learned how to use sewing machines, to work with thread, all those kinds of things. She even says she wrote some poetry. And all this, she says, was part of her invention process. MIT metallurgist Cyril Stanley Smith, one of the people who developed the atomic bomb, metals and so forth, said, I've slowly come to realize that the analytic quantitative approach I've been taught to regard as the only respectable one for a scientist is insufficient. The richest aspects of any complicated system arise from factors that cannot be measured easily, or if at all. And for these, the artist's approach, uncertain as it inevitably is, seems to find and convey more meaning. He, of course, studied arts. So did Robert Wilson. He's the physicist who designed and invented the cyclotrons and built Fermilab in Illinois. He was also its main architect, and he's got lots of papers where he talks about things like, in designing an accelerator, I proceed very much as I do in making a sculpture. I felt that just as a theory is beautiful, so too is a scientific instrument, or that it should be. And then further down here, one thing is clear, and it is that there is much in common between what the creative artist does and what the scientist does. One final example from one of our National Academy of Sciences members, Eric Heller, who's a chemist and physicist at Harvard. He has loved to make electronic art, often converts the mathematical equations he's using for his physics and chemistry modeling into images such as the ones that are shown here. And he says he's made at least 3 major discoveries directly through his artwork. Because, for example, I was making plots for artistic purposes and noticed a branching phenomenon that we had missed scientifically, which led to further development of the phase-space flow of the electrons. Through art, he says, one can sometimes get straight to the essence of the matter and almost get an intuitive comprehension that might otherwise take years of study. All right, so clearly integrative networks. How do we incorporate this into education? I've come up with 6 basic ways. There are probably more. One is to focus on the common aspects of the creative process. As you've already seen, lots of people say the creative process is very similar. Another is to focus on fundamental principles and how they apply across disciplines or specialties. A third is to cultivate curiosity and wonder. Lots of education has to occur because people are excited and want to teach themselves. Almost all the people that we've been talking about so far in this talk were at some level autodidacts teaching themselves their material. A fourth is to talk about prior exemplars, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later on. A lot of our science education, medical education, has no people in it. It's simply principles and results. We don't let the students have any idea how we actually get there. The 2 I'm going to focus on for a few minutes as I go forward here are the 5th one here, problem-directed challenges, and the 6th one, focus on transdisciplinary tools for thinking. So let me go straight to those. One of the things that I've discovered over the years is that innovations almost always start with inventing new problems or challenges. This, again, is not something that we teach our students to do, but we really need to. So if you think about it, Taussig discovered the blue baby syndrome problem, not the solution to it. But that was the critical thing. Understanding the problem in depth allowed the solutions. Fleming discovered the anomalous microbial interaction. He didn't discover penicillin. He discovered that the penicillium fungus was doing something really weird, which was different than anything else he'd ever seen. He needed to know what it was. Croto didn't actually solve C60 compounds. He recognized the problem that it was only C60. That's all they were seeing. You weren't seeing carbon 59, carbon 58, carbon 61 compounds. And that then became the problem that led to the discovery of fullerenes. Why isn't it something else? Why is nothing else showing up? So Einstein talked a lot about this in his work. The mere formulation of a problem is far more essential than its solution, he says, which may be merely a matter of mathematical or experimental skills. To raise new questions, new possibilities, to regard old problems from a new angle requires creative imagination and marks real advances in science. Then in another place, he said something which I found extremely striking. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and then only 5 minutes thinking about the solution. Wow. This is so different from the way that I certainly was taught to think about problems. The problem was given to me and you immediately started working on the solution. But what Einstein is saying is, if you got the problem wrong, if you don't understand the constraints, if you don't understand what you're trying to do and what the problem's about, it doesn't matter whether you try to solve it or how hard you try to solve it, you've got the wrong problem. So what we need to teach is problem generation. So this is where discovering comes in. This is a major part of that book. And at the end, after giving a series of case studies of how Nobel Prize winners did this, I generated a series of techniques, if you will, which include things like looking at nature like a child. It's amazing how many major discoveries were made simply because I wonder why the sky is blue, or what makes the grass green. Experiencing the sublimity of the mundane, looking at everyday things and wondering why they're there. Searching for unexplained patterns, anomalies, paradoxes, assumptions, so forth. These are all ways that people have done things, and I won't go into any great detail. If you're interested, you can follow this up in Discovering. I will point out, however, there is only one curriculum that I know that actually formally teaches ignorance, and that is the University of Arizona Medical School's curriculum on medical ignorance, which is run by Marlise Whitty. It was actually founded by Marlise and her husband, Charles, who died a few years ago, and Ann Kerwin, who was a philosopher, and she's retired. So Marlise carries on. You've probably heard of the kinds of terms that they use, which originated here. Unknown unknowns, the things that you know you don't know. Unknown unknowns, all the things you don't know you don't know. This, by the way, is why we run controls and experiments, because sometimes the control works and nothing else does, and now you know something you didn't know you didn't know. Errors, things that you think you know, but you don't. Unknown knowns, all the things you don't know you know. We often have implicit knowledge that we need to get out. Taboos, things that you are not allowed to know. And denials, things that are too painful to know, which we know, but we refuse to accept them. You probably heard Donald Rumsfeld use these kinds of terms, and I'm sorry to say he probably picked them up from Honey Mud Maggots. We went to the same school, and the book was reviewed and talked about in a journal that I know he reads. So if you're interested in the development of these honey mud maggots and rethinking AIDS, are both direct applications where I talk about known unknowns, unknown unknowns, errors, and so forth and so on in quite explicit detail. So, second strategy. First one was teach people how to raise problems. The second is to have a common language and way of thinking about problems across disciplines. And we call these tools for thinking. These are developed in our book, Sparks of Genius, that Leon mentioned earlier. This is something I wrote in collaboration with my wife, who is a historian and poet. We looked at about 300 or 400 of the world's most creative people in many different fields: engineering, medicine, science, dance, literature, you name it. And we kept finding the people using the same language over and over again. They would say, the key to my creativity is being able to observe and imagine what I'm doing, and then manipulate those images and then abstract out the key essentials from them recognize patterns in those key essentials, work with them, often transforming them into something that is physical, using proprioceptive thinking, sometimes thinking about things literally as I know I have a problem because I feel uncomfortable. And I can tell this in my students when they're listening to a lecture and they're like somewhere else. They have a body language that tells me they're not comfortable with what I'm telling them. Creative people pay attention to these things. They need to synthesize these things, think in dimensions, make models, and so forth and so on. So this is where the language comes from. It comes from literally the creative people talking about what they do and how they do it. So I'll just give you a couple brief examples. Georgia O'Keeffe on observing. So she did wonderful paintings, often wall size, of flowers. Why did she do this? She did it to make us see, because she says still in a way nobody sees a flower really. It's so small and we haven't time. And to see takes time, like to have a friend takes time. Now, everybody supposedly wants their physicians and their nurses and their scientists and their engineers to observe. Take a look at where you actually teach observing and how you teach it, because most people just assume that we're able to do that. They don't actually teach it. Sir Francis Seymour Hayden, on the other hand, who was one of the greatest surgeons and pathologists of the late 19th century in England, was himself a painter and an etcher of quite renown. If you look him up, you'll find his art is in all the major museums around the world. He forced his students to, his medical students, to take painting and drawing classes, because he said, how much sooner with the eye accustomed to observe, and I can't read this because it's covered up here on my thing, and estimate closely the differences of color, aspect, weight, and symmetry. Learn to gauge their apparitions as the signs of the disease. How much better would the hand, trained to portray them accurately, be able to direct with precision and safety the course of the knife? Once you've observed, then you need to know what you've observed. Think about it. This involves abstracting, because everything we observe is much too complex and there's much too much there for us to take in. So Picasso shows us that abstracting is a process. What's a bull? It's what you can take away and still leave the concept of bullness. That's what Santiago Ramon y Cajal was doing with his drawings. On the left-hand side is one of his many drawings, many of which are still used in textbooks in preference to photographs, because he has abstracted out all the unnecessary detail and given us only what you should be looking for in a real specimen. That's what we need, are these abstractions. Another tool is analogizing. Direct sequencing works like syncopation, to go back to one of our earlier examples. The Gateshead Millennium Bridge was invented by engineers and architects who said, okay, we need a pedestrian bridge which can allow people across this canal, but we need to be able to open it up to allow the boats to pass under it. What goes up and down? They realized an eyelid did it, and then used the eyelid as an analogy for designing the bridge. Another one of the tools which we found lots of people talking about was body thinking. So Auguste Rodin, with his thinker, really hammers this home. He says, what makes my thinker think is that he thinks not only with his brain and his knitted brow, but his distended nostrils, his compressed lips, with every muscle of his arms, back, and legs, his clenched fist and gripping toes. Thinking doesn't happen just in our brains. So we see this when we think about Carroll and his embroidery. Thinking was, to a large extent, in his hands. Vivian Thomas, inventing tools and different techniques, same thing. Fabric engineer Ellis, embroidering, mechanical things. He's transforming what his body can do into a robot, essentially, who will do it for us. He has to know how to do that himself before he can. So another tool related to body thinking is empathizing and play acting. In order to get into that machine and program it to do something, you have to know what the machine wants to do and what you want to do. And lots of scientists talk about becoming the object they study. So here's Evelyn Fox Keller, whose book about Barbara McClintock is very, very famous, A Feeling for the Organism. She has lots of quotes in there about McClintock, who won a Nobel Prize for discovering jumping genes, saying she went down the tube of her microscope, down into the chromosomes, until she understood them well enough to look at them as individuals. And then they became my friends, she said. And that's the important part, is that you become one of them. Now, that's not the usual way we think about things, but we found scientists in all sorts of different areas talking about this. Desmond Morris is an example, famous for writing The Naked Ape, zoologist at Oxford University. He was also a surrealist painter. And here's The Entomologist, where he talks about becoming a bug to understand it. One final tool I'll talk about here, I guess one of two last tools. One is playing. We don't give our students much time to play, but almost all creative people say that play is one of the most important tools that they use when they are problem raising and problem solving. We define it as a goalless activity performed for fun or enjoyment, as a pastime that incidentally develops skills, intuition, knowledge, and thereby understanding. Here, the lab supervisor is yelling at Gunderman, something tells me you're not taking this experiment seriously, because of course he's put glasses with a big nose on the output. However, think about Fleming's play. He's playing around with making paintings out of bacteria, without which he would have not developed the skills or the observations to make his discovery. In fact, you could argue that all science is imaginative play. So here's a quote from Nobel laureate Francois Jacob, one of the people who discovered feedback inhibition. Behind him are some of his own paintings. He directly attacks the way we teach scientific thought by saying, contrary to what I once thought, scientific progress did not consist simply in observing, accumulating experimental facts, and then drawing up a theory from them. It began with the invention of a possible world, or a fragment thereof, which was then compared by experiment with the real world. And it was this constant dialogue between imagination and experiment that allowed one to form an increasingly fine-grained conception of what's called reality. So one of the things we need to teach our students is imaginative play, where they invent how the world might be and compare it to the way it is. Jacob Shaham, who is a Columbia University physicist, gave us some ways of thinking about how to do this. Acting, he said, taught me to read equations like a script with characters that I had to bring to life. Play acting, transforming equations into bodily feelings, into an understanding, say, a model of what those equations are doing, is actually, according to people I've talked to at Caltech and MIT, the biggest problem that their students have. All of their students can solve equations. Very few of them can do what Hodgkin could do, which was to take the equations, turn them into pictures, and then into models to see what was actually going on. All right, so quickly, I'm going to try to get through the next few slides and sum up here. Visual imaging and mental modeling, just to give you some idea, correlate directly with founding new scientific companies. We looked at 235 scientists and engineers, asked them what kinds of mental tools they use to do their work, and those who were founding companies used mental models and visual imaging the most. Physical modeling, verbal was highly associated with patenting and publishing lots of articles. People, however, who used mainly verbal thinking, tried to memorize everything they knew, did not do well on these things. In fact, they didn't do well in patents, licenses, articles, or books. So passive knowledge, simply learned as a verbal formulation, doesn't do much. I'll also just mention in passing, I'm not going to go through the data here, but we've done two different sets of studies showing that the kinds of tools an individual will use, mental tools, are highly correlated with the sets of avocations they develop. And both of those are highly associated with their achievements. The more tools they use, the better their achievement outcomes, and the better or the more avocations they have, the wider the range of tools, as well as the wider range of achievements. So now we take a look at how these tools are used by scientists and engineers. Again, the same 235 individuals I just mentioned. I'll point out that every single tool I've mentioned is used by some subset of these people. All of them used multiple tools. Of course, everybody uses intuition and logic. Everybody has to be able to image things, see them in their mind. But there are people who do things like analogizing, empathizing, playing, transforming, which I've talked about, which are very important to their success. This is a challenge for our scientific education, medical education, engineering education, because we've gone through and now looked at high school and college textbooks and looked for explicit mention of these tools. The textbooks, which are shown in the blue, and the red is the same data I just showed you a minute ago from the scientist survey. The blue shows that the textbooks talk about observing, they talk about modeling. Every once in a while, one explicitly mentions analogizing or abstracting. All the other tools are missing, including transforming, playing, empathizing, body thinking, even imaging, and pattern recognition. This is really scary. We are not giving our students a clear idea of how people in the sciences actually work. All right, so what do we need to do? Becoming a creative innovator requires individualized polymathy. We've seen that in everything I've been doing. Each individual finds a unique set of problems because they're trained within a unique set of combinations of talents, knowledge, techniques, skills, and so forth, which means that the kind of one-size-fits-all education we've been using, where everybody in a given major gets exactly the same education, is not good. When everyone wears the same hat, they all look the same, they all think the same, they all behave the same. So what we need to do is something which I call the Royal Ascot alternative. These are hats worn by the women at Royal Ascot meetings. And you can see they're all extremely individual. How do we do this? Last few minutes here. The Y-shaped student. So as an immunologist, one of the things I've always been fascinated by are antibodies and their structures, which are made in sort of this Y shape that you can see on the left-hand side here. Each antibody is unique. Different colors represent different abilities to bind to different foreign materials. People have done something really interesting in the last few years, which is to take antibodies apart and put them together in new ways. So they can take one antibody, combine it with another antibody, and now you have an antibody thing that can grab onto two different things. This is my analogy for what we need to do as students. You've probably heard of the T-shaped student, where we have one leg going way down deep, and the student gets a very formal education and deep education in one subject, and the T then has a broad set of liberal arts kinds of skills of communicating, a little bit of statistics and this, that, and the other thing. The problem is that this doesn't lead to people who can integrate anything. One of the key things about an antibody is the two arms are linked to each other. And this is key to my idea of what a Y-shaped student is. I think what we should be doing is training students who have two expertises. One which can grab and knows one set of concepts very, very well, and the other arm which can grab and has the ability to understand another set of concepts very well. So basically two majors. They go very deep, like the legs in the T, but They reach up, and this is one of the reasons we have a why, into the future and ask the question that hasn't been asked before. We train them to think about things, to combine things, to ask new questions in new ways that people haven't done before. Therefore, a Y-shaped student is a questioning student, thus the pun on why. I'll just point out that, again, we've done lots of studies on this. Statistically, you can look at the Nobel Prize winners. Virtually every Nobel Prize winner, somewhere around 80%, have training in more than one science, formal degrees in more than one science. 70% of them have training in another domain altogether: history, philosophy, art, you name it. So that about 50% of them are polymaths in both intra-domain within two or more sciences and across sciences and arts or history or social sciences or something like that. These people are very typical of what we see in honor students. So I think the place to start with implementing a Y-shaped education is with honor students. Many of them would like to double major. Some of them already are. If we require them to have 2 majors, we require them to have a transdisciplinary integrative senior thesis, then they're going to have to start thinking about how to take their various interests and put them together. I've laid out a series of integrative strategies, tools for thinking, problem-directed research, prior exemplars, etc., to allow them guidelines as to how to go about that. And I think we should put the onus on the student to do the integration. Faculty can still advise in each of their expertises. This is what I did when I was a college student. I did a very multidisciplinary senior thesis. I had 3 advisors from 3 different colleges. They each looked at what I did to see whether what I had done in their area was up to snuff, but I was the one who had to integrate. This trains students to generate their own challenges. It allows them to integrate and work with experts, because expertise is still something they need to be trained into, and they need to learn how to live up to those standards. But it also then forces them to develop strategies for collaborating with other people by defining common problems, direct experience of creative processes, and developing a common language. And I'll just point out that statistically, again, probabilistically, this is going to give us a group of people who can do something that is very unusual. If you have a standard education with 100 majors, you've got 100 problem sets that you've trained people to solve. With a Y-shaped education where every student develops their own combination, you have the potential for 10,000 possible permutations with only 100 majors. When people start collaborating, that's hundreds of thousands of permutations. That's hundreds of thousands of new problems, new possibilities, new solutions. So that's a start, but more generally, I'd also say that we should teach ignorance. We can do this in every class. This, again, is not my innovation. I had a professor who taught cell biology when I was an undergraduate. He would end every class with 10 minutes about all the things that didn't make sense about what he just said, the anomalies, contradictions, paradoxes, and inconsistencies in the data that were out there that everybody just sort of leaves out of the textbooks and glosses over. We should distill teaching down to principles rather than striving for completeness, and to show how those principles can be used across specialties rather than trying to get every fact into our curriculum, because we can get the students, once they understand the principles, to go out and look for the applications and share them with each other and become teachers for each other. And I think we should reintroduce people into the curriculum, because, as I said earlier, we don't give people a sense of the creative process, the individualized knowledge, and the frustrations, problems, sets of skills, resources, and so forth that go into actually being an innovative person. Students, I believe, need role models for the creating innovative process, whether it's you or other people. So here are the 5 C's of an innovative education. Identify novel challenges by practicing problem finding. Embrace constraints by using problems to define the box in which you work. Expand capabilities by making sure your box is big enough to encompass multiple problems, and that means becoming a polymath. Practice to create a process, either directly and or by exemplars. And the last one is copying successful innovators. You can learn by doing what they've done. Thank you.
Professor Root-Bernstein, thank you so much for the fascinating presentation. I'd read many of your papers. I've got your book. I've read so many, I've reread it so many times, but you've presented us with stuff here that I'd never heard of before. This is absolutely fascinating. So, Professor Bernstein, with your permission, and I know you've been going been over an hour now, and thank you very much for the participants for staying along.
Yes.
We've got some questions, and I wonder if we could start with Dr. David Favre, or as my wife's last name is Favre, spelled F-A-V-R-E. So can I ask Dr. David Favre for the first question, please? David is with the Center for Innovation, Teaching and Learning.
Yes, thank you. Please, and you can please call me David. That's fine. My question is a lot of information. And I thank you for your talk and discussion. I really hope that Leon can make this video available to us, because I'd like to review it again several times. And as you were talking, I was thinking about this idea of FAR transfer. This comes from my field of study, educational psychology.
Yep.
And I'm sure you've heard of it. Yeah.
Yep.
A lot of the creative solutions that you had were like making connections between diverse fields. You know, sometimes surgery and silk weaving or carpentry. And a lot of these connections were just from random circumstances, or maybe very fortunate circumstances. If somebody happened to be working in a lab or happened to have a particular skill that they could maybe see that pattern. And I guess my more directed question is, how can someone use a strategy to search these diverse fields without mastering another one? I know you're talking about the Y-shaped student, which is great, and I think that's going to definitely improve the probability that there will be creative solutions. But as each field, you know, with the internet and people getting more professionalized in each of the fields, it takes a lot to master any one field nowadays. If I was working in one particular field and I had a problem and I wanted to like purposely search other fields, but I didn't know which field to search, are there strategies that maybe I might be employed to maybe see patterns in other fields that I may not be aware of without quite mastering them?
Sure. So my wife and I have published something for Leonardo, which is a journal for the International Society for Science, Technology, and the Arts, Art, Science, Technology, ISAST. It's a 3-part review of art, science curricula, and it directly addresses the issue you talked about, whether there's near transfer, far transfer, those kinds of things. So if anybody's not aware of that language, basically it comes down to lots of educational psychological studies have basically said that if I train a person in painting, the skills may transfer near to drawing or vice versa, but it's unlikely that they will transfer, say, to engineering, because that's far transfer. And what's the utility of the, learning a drawing technique to an engineer? So one of the things that we looked at was what's the point of doing art or music or any of these other things in a science STEM curriculum in general, and which ones have actually been successful. So what we concluded was, to begin with, everybody who's done this successfully pedagogically has used one of the tools for thinking I'm talking about, or sometimes more than one. So if you want far transfer, you begin by saying, how am I thinking about the problem? Am I trying to teach observing? And how do I use observing in, say, painting? How do I use it in, a biology class? And what are the specific skills that I can transfer between those two things? It turns out when you define the problem that way, you can easily get far transfer to occur. If you simply say, I'm going to have a student learn to paint as, Seymour Francis Hayden did, and now we're going to walk in and you're going to be a better surgeon, that probably doesn't work very well. In his case, of course, he did it explicitly, so he was teaching his students how you would use those skills. So again, he's making a bridge, if you will. We call them bridges. So one type of bridge are the tools. What's the skill that you need? Another is the problem, what I call problem-defined research or learning. So if you think about Carroll and his new techniques of surgically sewing things together. One of that connection was actually there in surgery from the beginning. So it wasn't like he was accidentally trained in embroidery and things like that. He was unusual in having done the history of his field. So it turns out if you look at the history of surgery, you find that all of the needles, the different kinds of thread, all those kinds of things come directly out of fabric parts and this is really strange, music. So the standard way that people used to sew people up was with catgut, and catgut was traditionally used for making stringed instrument strings. And if you go back to the 18th century before and you're a surgeon, you are literally told to go to the local musician to get your catgut. So a lot of these connections we simply lost by not knowing the histories of our field. We don't know where our techniques or knowledge came from. So that's another way that you can make those kinds of connections. Partly what I'm doing when I'm talking about having students take their two interests is we've actually found both personally with students, but also there's a high school which does much of what I'm talking about in Israel, where they do this. If you give the students this kind of challenge, they will find the connections. Somehow inside themselves, they know what they're doing and why, but they never needed to do it explicitly. When they're challenged to make it explicit, they do it. And it's important to have them do it rather than us do it because as teachers, we're limited to what we know and what we can do. And the whole point here is to get them to discover possibilities we don't. In a number of cases, people did things for years without really seeing the connection and discover it much, much later. So Richard Feynman's an interesting example. He did a lot of his physics by rolling on the ground and making weird whooping sounds, and he transformed every equation into a movement or a sound or something else. I mean, it was all transformative for him. He didn't come to bongo drumming till he was something like 40, at which point he discovered that all these patterns which were in the equations were things that he could use in bongo drumming and vice versa. So there are very strange things where people do things without being explicit, which are also there.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
David, thank you for the fascinating question. And Bob, thank you for the amazing, insightful response. Bob, we don't only have faculty and staff today present, we also have students. And I'm really glad there are a few engineering students involved, but I think you'll be especially glad to hear that one of your old students is present, Caitlin Moraine.
Yep.
Caitlin, welcome. And Caitlin has a question which she'd like to direct to you.
Great. Now I'm in trouble.
No, not at all. Hi, Dr. RB. Thank you again for having me. This was a phenomenal presentation. I just had a question as a student, especially who's in my postgraduate education now, and we don't really have the option to double major per se in medical school.
Yep.
So as we continue our training in residency, you can choose two different fields of that, but it's quite different than what you were talking about with the double major. So for individuals like myself or other students in postgraduate education who are immersed in a scientific curriculum that may not emphasize creativity, I was wondering if you had any advice on how to maintain a creative approach to our education.
Yeah, so there are a couple of possibilities. One is if you've got an avocation of some kind, a hobby, which something you like to do, I really recommend that people continue doing it. If you're going to do art, music, fabric arts, whatever it is. And then, develop those skills as best you can and start looking for connections. So in medicine, a lot of these are really easy. There are whole curricula on arts and medicine, poetry and medicine, music and medicine. As I've mentioned in a number of the examples I gave, fabric arts have played a very important role. Carpentry as skills have played an important role. There's basically nothing that you can do which can't be, pulled into your medical practice. When you start looking into some of the famous, physicians, a lot of them, almost all the great surgeons will talk about either having a carpentry background or a fabric arts background. It's really astounding. There are a huge number who have been poets and playwrights, and the reason for doing that was explicitly to start thinking about the importance of story and of language, because everything we do is certainly in primary care with a patient involves us communicating with them and them communicating with us. So listening for what they don't say, listening for the structures that they use in telling you something can tell you as much about what's going on and how they're feeling about their problems, whether they're understanding what you're actually telling them. So there was a conference I went to once where the president of the AMA got up and said, "We've got a problem." And he said, "I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm just going to show you the video and you'll see what it is." They showed interviews where they had taken several physicians who were talking to patients about their diagnosis and their treatment. And the one that I especially remembered was a doctor who had a patient who had hypertension, and he brings him in and he says, "So we've done all the tests and you've got hypertension, and do you know what that is?" And the patient says, "Yes." And he says, "So can you tell me what it is?" He says, "Yeah, my wife says I'm hyper all the time." And the doctor just keeps, he doesn't even hear this. He just keeps going. He says, "Yeah, okay, so we're going to have to lower your blood pressure, and we're going to give you this drug." And he explains, what the drug is, all in technical terms. And he says, "Did you understand what I said?" And the patient says, "Yes." And he says, and we're going to have you take the pill, by mouth. Let me see, how did it go? You take the medicine, I forget how doctors say this, twice a day. Anyway, it comes out sounding like one pill twice a day. And the patient's like, "Yeah, I understand, okay." And they go through the whole thing. Then they take the people into separate rooms and they ask the doctor, "How do you think it went?" He said, "I thought it went great." I asked the patient if they understood. The patient said they understood. I gave them a chance to ask questions. They didn't ask any, so I'm sure that they understand. And then in the other room, they're interviewing the patient who's like, "I have no idea what I've got. I mean, what does me being hyper have to do with why I'm feeling this way?" And how do I take one pill twice a day? Am I supposed to spit it out and swallow it again? Or, I mean, it was just astounding to listen to the whole thing. Language skills are so critical here. So anything, I mean, literally anything you can imagine is going to be useful. The other thing you can do is you can go out and take, classes outside. I'm sure it's hard in medical school, but people take dance classes, they go and take a carpentry class, they do something. And there are actually studies, not in the US, but a huge number in the UK, which show that physicians who take the time out to do something like that are much more likely to say that they have high satisfaction in their job and to stay a physician past the age of 50. And that's really important because more and more physicians are burning out really early and leaving the profession. It's too intense and they don't do anything else. They go home and they crash. Having this other thing that you do is not only potentially useful for your medicine, it's potentially life-saving for your career and your life. And I think that's also really important.
Definitely. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, Caitlin.
And Caitlin, thank you so much. We also have, as participants today, a number of designers from the Seabell Center for Design. Rachel Switsky unfortunately had to leave, but she thanks you for being here today, Bob. But Rachel Ditkus and Lucas O'Brien and Alex Pagano have questions or comments. So I'd like to ask Rachel Ditkus if you could please start with your comment. Rachel, thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Leon. So I, thank you so much for this talk. This has been, it's very just synonymous with, I think, a lot of the work that we do at Siebel Center for Design. And I echo David's comment from earlier. If if and when the video is available, it'd just be great for all of us to be able to go back and review it. I typed my comment in the chat, and I added a bit of a like augmentation and a question, because I started seeing Lucas's comments and then Alex's comments, so we're thinking some similar things here. And I really think it's important for us. Like we need to keep hearing about the value of Y-shaped students, learners, and I think also just citizens of the world. And for us, we at Siebel Center for Design, we believe that this is an approach that we are celebrating constantly in the work that we do while focusing on human-centered design. And I think one of the things that we've seen, just over the years in both in the design industry, just industries at large, really fill in the blank, any industry, there's been such a push for T-shaped people. And, what we have found, and I think, many of us who are on the, the webinar right now, is that we really embrace maybe just either by accident or with like deep intention, this more of this Y-shaped approach. I mean, for me, myself, like my two, arms of the Y are social work and design. So two very different, but also very similar disciplines, but have like a deep need of getting depth in that knowledge. And so I'm wondering though, doing that, which is something that I love and gives me great meaning, and I've been very passionate about over the past decade, it has come with great pains and I think occasional opportunity costs. There's a lot of criticism, really at the end of the day. And so I'm wondering just what additional suggestions you might have for current students in academia, and plus those of us who are working in academia, so trying to really support and foster that approach and that kind of learning and development in students and also amongst our peers and our colleagues.
Yep. The opportunity costs are definitely high. I mean, starting the kind of education we're talking about, and each of us individually doing it, is only the beginning. We are clearly stuck in a 19th century or earlier version of a institution that has departments rather than problems. I mean, if we were to reorganize a university along the lines that I'm thinking, the departments would constantly be shifting They might exist for 10 or 15 years and they'd be focused on, major problems like healthcare. So you're gonna have to bring together a whole bunch of people who have an interest in that. And that's people from everything: economics, social work, design, medicine, insurance, you name it. We're going to have those people all in the same room. That's virtually impossible to do with our universities right now. And so what you're saying is people like me, people like you who have multiple arms, pay a price for doing that. That's absolutely true. There are now some formal studies. There's a small group of people getting together. We call ourselves polymath studies people. So we're going out and looking at polymaths and how they succeed or fail, or the challenges they have. There are real challenges. And until the system actually understands the value of this flexibility and things like that, it's going to be difficult. For students who want to do what we're doing, I basically suggest that they focus on doing one of the arms professionally and do it better than everybody else. That's what I found I have to do. I'm a physiologist by profession. I mean, this makes no sense. I never studied physiology. I have no background in it. It simply happens to be a department I got stuck in. I do write more papers, get more citations, whatever, than most of my colleagues, with working only half my time in that field. This is really tough. The good side of it is what I just said to Caitlin Moran, which is I use the other half of my time to keep myself excited about what I want to be doing. So my relaxation is what other people would probably call doing more work. But all of these case studies, for example, that I just gave, that's what I would go do. I'd go home and, after dinner, I'd pick up a biography or an autobiography of a famous scientist or an artist or somebody like that, and read and take notes on it. And then I'd put it in a file. And after a while, you start seeing patterns in it. And then I'd start writing papers about it and eventually books about it. This was done out of pure love. It was not done because I got any return from the university. In fact, it was exactly the opposite. When my first book came out, they said, "Why did you waste your time writing it?" When my second book came out, they said, "You're going to have 2 CVs, one which is the professional one, and one is the other stuff you do." Things like that. For years, I did art, never told anybody about it. So I think it's really unfortunate that we call ourselves a university, which should imply universal knowledge and how to integrate it and so forth. And we're doing exactly the opposite, which is splitting and splitting and splitting. I don't know what the solution is until the universities start changing. And what I can tell you is businesses are much more open than the universities are to this, because they do have to change all the time. They have to keep up with competition. Bizarrely, universities don't compete in the same way as businesses do, which is another interesting factor here.
That is such great wisdom, and even though you and we may not know the precise answers, just the sheer offering of the validation is I think that takes my heart about 1,000 miles forward. So thank you for that.
Well, I think the really interesting thing is, I've been working in this area for 30 years now, and only in the last year have more and more people been saying what you're saying. They're coming out and saying, I'm like this. I'm having difficulties doing it, but I can't see any other way to do it because this is what works. Why is this so difficult? Why can't other people see why this is valuable? And that in itself, I think, is a very positive step. At least it's becoming public, and We're facing major problems. We're facing, COVID, healthcare, the economy, you name it. These are not problems that an expert can solve anymore. And maybe that combination of formal understanding that there are people who are doing transdisciplinary integrative work that's valuable, and the transdisciplinary problems that are out there will finally make them work.
Bob, thank you very much. Rachel, thank you very much. As instructors, the team that I'm a part of, called the Engine Team, Engagement in Engineering Education, we're constantly looking for ways to get students to engage cognitively with the subject contents, but also emotionally, and also to connect emotionally with one another and with me, the instructor. Now, this has become really difficult during Zoom times, as you alluded to just now, Bob. But Lucas O'Brien with the Seabell Center has a difficulty with something that you mentioned just now. And I'd like to ask Lucas if you could please pose your question.
Yeah, I can ask the question, and then I think what I'm really looking for is a little bit of clarification, because I love a lot of what you just said there. And the question that I had was the comment that you made about the onus being on the student to bridge together these disciplines, and how do you kind of reconcile that with also knowing that we need, like as students, I recently graduated in 2019, and I wish that I had more professors who were champions of this Y-shaped individual. Certainly had them. I had wonderful professors at this university, but I wish that more of them were, I guess in talking with professors now, the word that would be is brave enough to kind of expose perhaps that more experimental side of themselves, or that unexpected side. And so maybe while that is not something that the institution of our universities is set up to do, how can we both as students express that we want to see that from our instructors, and then as instructors be willing to step up and put ourselves out there in that way? I guess that's a tweak to the actual question that I put in the chat.
So, I mean, I think this is actually linked to what Leon was just talking about being emotionally involved in your education as well. So when I say the onus is on the student, I don't actually mean that they have to figure out all this by themselves. As I said, there are strategies we should be using, such as giving exemplars, putting the creative process in. As Caitlin Moraine will tell you, having taken one of my classes, one of the things I try to get my students in an autoimmune disease class is to start out their presentations by talking about a real patient. Most people don't, who are teaching physiology, immunology, don't do this. It's all about what's the T cell doing? And what are the principles by which, okay. What I want my students to understand is we're learning this because people are in need of this, and they're real people, and they're suffering, and these are the kinds of sufferings they're having. And this is not just theoretical, and it's not even just practical. If I give them this drug and this is why it works, we're dealing with real people with real problems and real, social issues and so forth. So that's one way to do it. Another way, and again, Caitlin took my class on autoimmune diseases, which, the whole class is what we don't know about autoimmune diseases. Yes, we can diagnose them. Yes, we can tell you what it is. We have no treatments that are anything but generic except for one or two of the autoimmune diseases. We have, just nothing that can cure them. We don't know the causes of any human autoimmune disease. So the whole class is all about students getting up and saying, basically, here's a little bit that we do know, and here are all the kinds of ignorance that we have about this thing. That is, on the one hand, really scary, because all the rest of the students' education has been about memorizing all the facts. And I'm sitting there going, but the facts aren't telling us anything. I just did this test, and it's clear that the red blood cells are being attacked by the antibodies. And okay, so, what can we do about that? We give them a blood transfusion, or we do this or whatever. But what is that? How does that get us any forward? And the answer is it doesn't. So then the next question is, so what do we need to know in order to make progress here? And that's where it gets exciting, because now students become part of their own education. They realize there are huge problems out there which they can get really involved in and excited about. And I don't care whether it's any of the problems I've raised in the class. It's just the idea that they're learning that everything they learn can be questioned and looked at, and there are places it falls apart. And that becomes a really exciting thing for people. So, you know, that's part of what's going on here. So again, not just the student, the professors have to be laying themselves out. What I'm doing is something a lot of my colleagues can't. I'm telling the students I'm an ignoramus most of the time. That's a great question. I don't know. Here's how I think we could go about looking into what is known about it. So, you know, next week, let's come back and do this. That makes education something we do together instead of something that's forced on people. It takes me out of being the expert, because I can't be an expert about everything. In fact, there are no experts in the unknown. It's one of the things I used to do a lot of consulting for industry. And that was the first thing I'd tell them. You know, if you hired me as an expert, you brought the wrong person. All I'm going to do is ask questions, because it's not what you know or what I know that's important. If that would solve the problem, you wouldn't have the problem. It's what we don't know that's really important here. So, you know, I don't know if this helps, but, you know, there are lots of things we can be doing, exemplars, how to pose, you know, problems that can be addressed, things like that, all the things I was talking about. Those can be incorporated into every class, and it's not a big deal. There's no reason you can't end every week with, here's what we don't know about the section I just taught you. Teach students how to raise problems. No reason you can't put in a couple exemplars of, you know, so I asked a group of students 10 years ago. We were staying in the hall. These were all honor students. They were some of my brightest people. Most of them were in my lab. I said, so we've all been working on insulin and, you know, some of its functions. Who discovered insulin? And they all stared at me. I'm like, I don't know. So I said, can you name the discoverer of anything that you've learned in your science classes? They didn't even know James Watson and Francis Crick for DNA. So I said, can you tell me how any major discovery that's in your textbooks was made? Anyone, I don't care, just anything. So what are you going to do if there's World War III and your father's diabetic and you need insulin? Where are you going to get it? You know what it is. You know what it does. Where's it come from? They had no idea. So I started giving a course on biomedical discovery, where every student had to pick a Nobel Prize winner and, you know, go through where'd they get the problem from, where'd they get the idea for a solution, how they developed the techniques, how was what they were doing different than everybody else, so what made them successful and other people fail. When they came up with the solution, what resistance did they meet? Every major discovery meets resistance. What are you going to have to prepare yourself for if you actually do something fantastic? Unfortunately, the world almost never runs to your feet and says, yes, give it to me. They'll go, you know, well, if that was the solution, we would have known that a long time ago. Nope, afraid not. There's no reason you can't put a couple of those kinds of things into your lecture. It doesn't have to be with every discovery, but just do with a couple.
Yeah.
You know, those are simple things to do.
Bob, thank you very much. Lucas, I hope that addresses some of your concerns, which are real and they resonate with me as well. My colleagues and I have been experimenting with self-directed learning, where, you know, it's not like we give the students a canvas and say, right, this is going to be paint by numbers, but we do indicate a few numbers on the canvas, which they should join. We proffer some solutions, but how they get from points number 8 to 9, that's totally up to them, but we give them some clues. So Bob, thank you very much for that insightful response to Lucas's question. there are 3 more questions, and then I think we're going to be on top of the hour because some people have to run to meetings or to lectures. But Alex Pagano is also with the Seabell Center and busy with his PhD. And his supervisor or co-supervisor is Professor Tony Jacoby. And his supervisor is, another supervisor is Professor Molly Goldstein. She's with systems engineering. So Alex, I'd like to ask you please to pose your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Leon, and thank you, Professor Root-Bernstein, for the presentation. Also, thank you very much for taking your free time to screen through those biographies and find all of those fantastic exemplars for us so that we can carry those examples forward and share those with our students and other people in our spheres. I have another sort of institutional barrier question. One of the things that many students sort of cling to as part of their educational metric is the grading aspect. You know, an A indicates that you're succeeding in this process, and a C may say that you need work, or you need work, so on and so forth. Grading and assessment is also incredibly useful for providing formative feedback to tell students what they need to improve on and where they need to improve on. And I'm wondering how the incorporation of sort of divergent and creative and generative learning fits into that paradigm, but especially in STEM, where much of the work that we're doing is convergent, where it's very easy to say if you've done something well or not, if you do or do not attain the correct answer. So do you have any advice or tips about how to assess student performance or progress in these areas?
Well, so there are sort of 2 answers. One is there have been a series of formal studies looking at whether grades predict success and or creativity. And the answer is no in both cases, which is really frightening. So it basically means that yes, we can look at those, the ability to solve the already solved problems, but it really doesn't help us figure out who's going to manage to do a good job later on. This is in medical schools, engineering schools, there are lots of different studies. So the first thing we should realize is, and the students should actually know this as well, is just because you're a straight A student doesn't really say much about your future. The second is, I think that there are ways of building in gradable, but not maybe graded in the normal way, exercises such as, here, I want you to be able to give the standard solution, but I also want you to see if you can come up with a different solution or a different route to the solution. So, and one of the things that I found really fascinating when I was a student was somebody gave me a book that had 450 different versions of the periodic table, all of which were valid. Okay, they all had the right order of the elements and they all had the correct patterns. There were 450 of them because each of those patterns revealed something beyond what the standard chart tells us about this. If you look at most theorems, there are multiple ways to proving the theorem in mathematics, and unfortunately we leave that out of education. So again, this doesn't have to be done on every exercise, but maybe the student picks an exercise or a set of questions, which I think in this case they should be able to do at home and work on their own time. Here's the standard solution. I'm going to try and do this in a different way. I'm not sure you even necessarily want to grade it on whether it's correct or not, but whether it's, got some insight or it's clever or, whatever it happens to be. Just the student having to try and do this differently in itself is going to be really useful. The other thing, which I sort of suggested a little bit earlier, is giving them, and I guess Leon in a sense just described this as well, giving them an open-ended question where it's sort of, here's the principle we just learned. You've learned to apply it on this particular system. How could you use this to build, devise, solve, whatever, some other problem in a related field? Again, open-ended in the sense that they have to go out and look beyond, say, mechanical engineering to chemical engineering and or structures in biomedicine or whatever it happens to be, and does this principle apply and where? Again, you don't have to be the expert to grade this. You can take a look at it and say, yeah, that makes sense, or not. And it's forced the student to go off and use their own investigative ability and imagination to sort of pose their own problem, or potentially to link into some other interest that they have.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Bob, thank you very much. Alex, thank you for that. The next question is from Professor Ram Haj, and following that will be Professor Tahir Saif, which I think would be the last question. Now, Professor Ram Haj with civil engineering, he and I and Alex, coincidentally, with colleagues from computer science, wrote up a proposal about so-called adaptive explorations, where students would be given the option to literally navigate themselves from one point in the course to the next, following the route that best resonates with them. Now, this becomes extremely challenging if you talk about large courses, but it becomes quite something to consider if you talk about courses with fewer than 50 students. Students can literally pick their own itineraries to go from one point in the course to the next. And you can gamify this. You can play this up. They earn certain points or extra credits if they pick a more difficult route than the more traditional route. But Ram and I hope to, and Alex hope that this will come to fruition next year. We hope to get funding for this project next year. But it really speaks to what you've been offering here, Bob. But Ram, can I ask you, because you have a different concern, an important one. Professor Ram Haj, please.
Yeah, thanks, Leon, and thanks, Bob, for a great presentation. This was it was really fascinating to me, and especially that it's a little outside my expertise area. But my question actually pertains to underrepresented groups and students from disadvantaged backgrounds, and I guess the concept that we make students choose a second major, which I think is a great idea, and has a tremendous amount of benefit, as you pointed out. But I guess my question and concern is about those students who feel a pressure to enter the workforce as soon as possible because of economic or material concerns within their lives. And would having them choose a second major be something that really discourages them from the educational experience, because presumably it would take more time and a longer time period before they could enter the workforce?
Very interesting question. Yeah, so I would think that this really hinges on whether they, so a couple different points. One would be whether they're fully funded or not. So if there, as many disadvantaged students have to work, in a sense, they've already got a second career, if you want, going. I know I have lots of students who are working 40 hours a week and trying to go to school 40 hours a week. That's tough. One solution I think might be to actually use that outside work experience as a valued educational experience. I don't care what job you're working at, there are all sorts of skills and there's all sorts of knowledge and all sorts of novel problems that you're facing all the time. And it's even if you're, ringing up a cash register in a McDonald's. If you've got a brain, you're sitting there watching the operation and learning things about how a McDonald's operates. That knowledge should become part of what we give them credit for, which we're not right now. So that's one possible solution, is that's their second major. It's what they have to do to survive. But, that's reality for a lot of people. The other part of that is that I don't know that the education I've laid out is essential for everybody. So yes, there may be people who, if you're going to be a brain surgeon and that's all you ever want to do, and that you're not planning to be innovative, you just want to go in there and fix what we know to fix, do you really need the kind of education I've talked about? If you're going to simply work as a civil engineer, determining whether the culverts are put in properly on a highway, do you really need what I'm talking about? Maybe not. So that's another thing, is we need to look at who actually needs this, how many people we need to be able to do this. And then there's a third point. The third point is this, I probably glossed over this in what I said earlier, but I think it's fairly important. One of the things that I've concluded is that we're teaching way too much. So I know engineering curricula tend to be very structured, and you got to have all the following stuff, and it's got to be in the following order, that kind of thing. My experience is that when you've learned the basic principles, if you actually master the principle, you can very rapidly learn how to apply it to new situations later on. And that if we can refocus a lot of our education onto what the basic principles are and stop giving every possible example and application, which is what the textbooks are looking like, we do better. So there's a famous guy named J.B.S. Haldane who worked in genetics, physiology, statistics. I don't remember the whole list of things, but he did all sorts of things. He only had a classics degree from Oxford as an undergraduate, yet he made world-renowned reputations in at least 6 different fields. He wrote a really interesting article where he basically said there's something wrong with what's going on, and that as we learn more and more and understand more and more, our textbooks should get smaller and smaller. and he had looked at the latest biochemistry textbook, which I think was something like 2,000 pages, whereas when he had been an undergraduate, it had been 150 or something, and said, what's wrong here? Does a person really need all the stuff we're actually throwing at them? So I think that's the other question we have to ask for these students. Maybe we're overwhelming them with more than they actually need, even for entering the workforce as soon as possible.
Great, thank you so much.
Ram, thank you for that important question. I'm sorry we are nearly out of time, but with your permission, I'm going to allow 2 more questions. Bob, would that be okay with you?
Yeah, fine.
Thank you so much. The next question also has to do with reality, real problems. And Professor Tahir Sahif, one of the senior professors in our Department of Mechanical Engineering, has a very important point to raise. Professor Tahir Sahif.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. This was fascinating morning today. Many of the things that you have touched upon, I think many of the professors, educators from school, high school, middle school, all the way to PhD levels have been thinking. So one issue that you brought up was the innovator's ability to dream and thinking about a future that doesn't exist now, but then work towards that dream and create the new reality, which becomes the new reality of tomorrow. For me, it seems that as we grow up, we all can dream. We are all artists. But then the more we go to the school system, somehow we begin to lose it.
Yep.
And, Picasso once said that, every child is an artist. The problem is, how do we remain artists as we grow up? Now, I'm going to make a comment which I may or may not offend someone here. My thinking, I come from Bangladesh, from Asia, and we have been under British rule for about 200 years. And it seems to me that a big part of the education system, were, at least in engineering, were developed, and maybe to some extent in some of the liberal arts as well, was to create a large workforce all over the world who could be copied from one place to the other. So from one colony, someone could be translated to another colony in Canada, and they would perfectly behave the same way as he or she was trained in some part in India, at that time, the Indian subcontinent. So somehow we are still in that mode of education system, but we learn the same thing no matter where we are, again, particularly in engineering. And as we go through the education system, our ability to think creatively, to dream about something in the future, seems to be jeopardized more and more for something that appears to be good for the short time, but not necessarily so good for the long term. It's less tangible for the long time. It's more tangible for tomorrow. So the question here is, the real question are we thinking of an education system that actually just does nothing? Let the dreaming mind remain a dreamer, rather than thinking about how to make people dream again. So in a way, if we put our hands off and let the education system teach to some extent what you have been promoting, is let the mind find its way to learn, rather than tell them what to teach, what to learn, and then produce a workforce that is good for, in the sense
Hi,
of...
I'm Bruce Stromberg, Director of Master's Climate Imaging and Bioengineering. On behalf of our entire bioengineering community,
there
it's
is
a
an
great
audio...
pleasure to welcome you to this session and introduce the 2020 NIIBS plenary.
There's something else going on here. I'm not so sure what's going on.
Dr. P.
I'm not sure.
Where is it coming from?
Everyone's microphones are muted except yours and Bob's, Tahir. So I have no idea where this mixed message.
Oh boy. Sorry. Okay, it's taken care of. Okay, it's gone now. So my question really, what bothers me, it had been bothering me for a long time, is are we in our education system suppressing creativity, or are we in an active way, rather than allowing the creativity that we come in and flourish? There was one study done by someone whom I don't remember now. His study was putting computers in the villages of India, and the kids could come in and touch the screen and look for things. And he did this pilot study in multiple of these villages, and he went back 6 months, every 6 months, and he asked the kids what they have learned. And soon he found out that the kids were becoming very familiar with molecular biology, from, in statistical physics, and very high level thought processes, just by touching the screen and finding images and creating their own and matching with their own intuitive feelings. I think one of the statements that you made was this: we as human beings have this strong intuition about the reality, which could shortcut many things in terms of understanding. So it's kind of a comment and a question. Really, the question boils down to, how do we design our next educational system that actually takes its hands off rather than put its hands on?
Yeah, obviously very complicated question, because I agree we probably need to renovate the entire education system from K up, which is beyond what I can certainly foresee. There are models which can do this. So I mentioned really briefly that I worked with a group in Israel, a high school group. So maybe this is a model which addresses some of your questions and concerns. The Israel, let me see, Israel Arts and Sciences Academy, that's what it's called. So IASA is based in Jerusalem. I consulted with them on setting up their curriculum about 25 years ago when they were first getting going. It was a rather bizarre origin in that I was working with a group based in the United States, which really did mainly music education and was shipping literally music and instruments and getting famous Israeli, violinists and things like that to give lessons to kids in refugee camps and all sorts of things. And they wanted to set up a high school for the arts in Jerusalem. They went to the Minister of Education, and he said, that's interesting. We were just about to set up a high school for math and science. Why don't we make it one high school? And how will we do this? So I was brought in, as well as another number of other people who had these bizarre backgrounds in many different fields, and we were asked to try and put together a curriculum. What they ended up doing was basically, it was for 10th through 12th grade. I think it now goes down to 8th grade. Kids were selected not on the usual, like an IQ test or whatever. It was whether they were passionate about something. That was it. Show me you're passionate about something. They had to major in one of the 4 areas, either art, music, science, or math. And all of them had a core curriculum together. So over half of all the classes they took together. They only specialized a little bit in each of their particular areas. In order to make this work, they were put in groups of 4, which always included one person in the arts, one person in music, one person in math, and one person in science. And they were told that they were all responsible for each other. So if you could be terrible in math and you couldn't draw, but your teammates were going to help you. So the artist would help you, learn how to draw, and the musician would help you learn your music. And so everybody became a teacher. And I think that was one of the really critical things that happened, was students become passive. And I think that's where they lose a lot of their creativity. These kids were never passive. Everything they learned, they had to turn into a lesson in their own way to help out their own friends. So, and the other thing was, they all learned to collaborate, because you never did everything on your own. You did it as a group. That didn't stop competition. Everybody competed as well. So the artist may never be a good mathematician, but that wasn't the point. And they learned that that was not the point. It wasn't the issue wasn't whether you were a great mathematician. The issue was you learned the math, and then on top of it, every group had to compete with others in open-ended problems. So for example, the first one was something that I designed, which was a kite flying contest. Why kites? Because there's culture, there's art and design, there's engineering, there's physics, there's the mathematics of calculating things. There's everything you want in there. There's the different materials that you can use to make it, which the scientists had to think about. They did it. So then they competed across all the campus, everybody against everybody else. They did these competitions pretty much the way we do the Science Olympiad, in that anybody on the team had to be able to answer anything about the design and the math and the engineering and the choice of materials and all that kind of stuff, whether you were the artist, the musician, or whatever. These kids invented, musical kites. I mean, they literally made music while they were flying because of the wind going through and things like this. I mean, they were just astounding things that they did. Every year they had a series of these things where they had to think about everything in the round. The best way of thinking about the outcome of this curriculum is to look at something called talpiot. So in Israel, everybody has to serve in the armed forces. And talpiot is the sort of like their DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration in the US. It's the thing everybody wants to get into. There are something like 400 high schools in Israel. Talpiot takes I believe it's 8 students a year from these 400 high schools. Something like 70% of the people over the last 20 years have come out of this high school. What Talpiot does is to think about novel problems and possibilities and new technologies, just the way our DARPA does. And they found that these kids are just phenomenal in terms of creativity, applications, being able to communicate, being able to collaborate with each other, generate new problems, you name it. It's exactly what they're looking for. So we can do this, but it requires all the students to do everything. There's another model, by the way, which is somewhat simpler. I remember my high school, or my elementary school, I don't remember having subjects. So I know at some point we learned what would probably be called geography, except that we had to draw our own maps from scratch. We had to label them. We had to put in economic data, population data. We had to, find out statistics about, what the major things that were exported, imported. We had to draw costumes of the people in different cultures. It was not something that would fit into any curriculum today. It was everything. You learned your math and your science. And this is actually the model that's being used in Finland right now. Finland is considered to have the best education system in the world, and certainly the most creative. All of their sections or sessions or whatever you'd want to call them are not divided into, learning Finnish history, learning math, learning whatever. They sit and they teach the students about the local economy. So if fishing is the big thing, they'll have a year on fishing where they learn everything you can do with fishing, including advertising about fishing and how the businesses run and the economics and the ecology, which means they have to learn the biology of the fish and, how healthy they are and everything else. It's a totally different kind of education. And again, the kids are, they draw it, they paint it, they do all these things. It's all integrated and they remain much more creative.
Bob, thank you so much for that. Bob, I think we'll have to invite you back again. It's clear that this can go on for a long, long time.
Yep.
We've got Mr. Bradley Klein, who's an architect and involved in maintenance at the university, and I'm sure he would have many questions as well. I think we'll have to invite you back. But the last question for the day is by Dr. Ava Wolf. And Dr. Wolf is with the Center for Innovation, Teaching and Learning. And her question actually relates to the previous one. Ava, could you please pose your question?
Hi, thank you for a fascinating talk. And I'm not sure what my question actually is, but I'm curious to know how the wonderful things that you've described here relate to Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. And I'm curious to know, do you think that this mode of thinking and teaching and learning would encourage the production of normal science or revolutionary science? And I'm just curious to know what you think about that and how you feel it comes together and along those lines.
So this is actually quite funny from my perspective, because I was Kuhn's last graduate student.
Oh, that is interesting. Well,
so I can definitely address this question. A lot of what I've been talking about comes out of having worked with Kuhn. So yes, when I think about innovators and so forth, I'm certainly thinking about the difference between normal science and revolutionary science. Actually, my dissertation was on something that Kuhn missed, which is there's a third type of science, which is new science. So that also was very important. These new sciences were things like immunology, biochemistry, biophysics, biology, radio, astronomy, whatever. Each one of these things is a combination of sciences where people on the two sides of the science would go. So I did my dissertation on physical chemistry. Before physical chemistry was invented, there were physicists going, some of this stuff really looks like chemistry, but I don't know any chemistry. And some people were going on the chemistry side were going, there's something about solutions that looks like it acts like the thermodynamics of gases, but I don't understand thermodynamics, so I can't address this. And so there's literally a definition of this intermediary area where there's sort of a recognition that there's something there between, but I don't know what it is, and nobody's properly trained for it. And the three people who got Nobel prizes for starting that were the most polymathic individuals I've probably ever come across. In addition to having math, physics, and chemistry, they often had meteorology, geology, geography. I mean, some of these people taught all of this stuff every semester. I mean, it was incredible. And then they were almost all artists and musicians on top of it. One of them was even a poet. I mean, it just expanded beyond belief. So that's sort of where I started looking at these kinds of innovations. Now, obviously, most people don't found an entirely new field. But when you get into the nitty gritties of, who invented the chip, there's a book called The Chip, which I really recommend. It is a beautifully written book about the process that Noyce and I forget the other guy who invented the chip went through to. They literally redefined the problem. They brought in all sorts of skills that other people didn't, and so forth and so on. And it's very clear about what they did that was completely different from what everybody else in engineering was doing at the time. These are big things, but even when I look at, my colleagues when they make breakthroughs, little breakthroughs are the same thing. There's something about the person who does the breakthrough, which always makes them a little different than everybody else in their field. They studied with somebody, on the other side of the world. They had, a break in their career and they went off and did something else because they literally couldn't afford to be in college. And, something they learned there allowed them to do it. I know a woman who developed the first roboticized version of a chemical combinatorial system. And I asked her, I'd worked with her for several years, and it was like, so I knew she was an organic chemist. She was a very fine one. And I said, where did this idea for robotics come from? She says, oh, when I was a kid, we were really poor. So I had to make my own toys. So I'm used to going to junkyards and just putting things together and making something that works. So, I'm like, why am I doing this the hard way? We should make it, a machine that does this for us. It's little things like that which make big differences often. And so, is that revolutionary? Probably not, but it's, still really important. So I'm not sure I actually buy into, the total normal revolution kind of thing. It's.
Yeah, I mean, well, I appreciate all what you said, and I'm especially interested in that that third area that you.
Yeah, well, the third area is in the. I
think that's the magic. That's right. The magic stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of things, when you look back at the history of things, it's somebody invents the car and they have the combustion engine and it's running along, but you have to sit there and crank it with a hand crank. I mean, every car now has an electric starter. Why did it take so long for somebody to, there's this gap between the electrical people and the combustion people. And I mean, historically, it makes sense because there were two kinds of cars. There were electrical cars and there were combustion cars, and they were competing, and the people didn't talk to each other. So the combustion people just do the combustion and the electrical do the electrical. But there was no reason that, you know, somebody couldn't take the electrical part, put it into the hand crank, and we could have had that a lot earlier. But there was this historical gap between things. There are weird things like that where you look back and it's all the gaps that are where the innovations end up coming into. And that's sort of why I want that why student. I want people who are taking two things and trying to figure out how to put them together, because not everybody will, but the experience, particularly as a student, the experience itself is highly educational. And it teaches you how to do it. And to me, it doesn't really matter whether every student who tries to do this is successful. It's learning the process and the skills to do that kind of thing that they should get out of it.
And the importance of talking to each other.
Yes, absolutely. And if you think about it, they're going to have, if you're going to take 2 or 3 things like I did, I had to learn to talk to a mathematician, a biophysicist, and what was the other thing I was doing? A biochemist. And none of these guys had ever met before. They didn't know what each other did. And I'm sitting in the middle. And so, you know, it's really weird experience for a 20-year-old to get these people together, and now you're the moderator. And I think that was really important for what I do now. And because I do this all the time, I take things from here and there and people and bring them together. And to me, it's natural. And other people look at it as going, what is he doing?
Thank you very much. That was very interesting.
Thank you so very much. Bradley Klein just posted a very nice message. And Bradley, I'm not even going to read it. Please, can I ask you to pose, because this is actually a very fitting final comment from our side. Bradley, would you mind just saying what you posted in the chat room, please?
My pleasure. It's been a wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. Lots of amazing things to think about. And I just wanted to make the point that you talk about the benefits of higher job satisfaction and less burnout, that you know, when the students are engaged in Y-shaped learning and professional development, you know, as professionals, I think that makes it pretty universally applicable to our students and to folks who want to lead a well-rounded life. So I appreciate your sharing that and sharing some statistical and just great examples of people who have excelled, you know, and won Nobel Prizes by doing this. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Brad. Bob, can I please ask you to stop sharing your screen?
Oh, sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob. It's been a fascinating 2.5 hours. I've got this book on the right, Sparks of Genius. Honey, Mud, Maggots, and et cetera, is the next on my reading list. And then discovering and then rethinking AIDS. Bob, your work is actually absolutely amazing. It's impossible to summarize what I've just experienced, but to steal a phrase from your book, The Sparks of Genius, you talk about synthesizing education. And the stuff that really most strongly resonate with me, not only from your book, but also from what you said this morning, is our dire need for multidisciplinary education. Whether it's, you know, a double major, however it's, you know, in whichever format it's dreamt up, but the urgent need for multidisciplinary education and for our students to collaborate with one another. The need for an integrative curriculum, increased connectedness, especially in this crazy time of COVID-19. the importance of co-creation, relevance, empathizing. And the big thing for me is to merge logic with imagination. Cognitive thinking with emotions. And you talk about universities, they need to transform from being centers of knowledge or institutes of knowledge to institutes of connections. We've got so much knowledge hanging around, drifting around. There's so many loose threads that are dying to be woven into a tapestry. But it needs us, to connect students with one another, to connect faculty with one another. And Bob, I'd like to thank you for your absolutely inspirational work over a long period of time. Thank you for taking your time, for sharing your fascinating insights with us this afternoon as well. It's immensely appreciated. I look forward to inviting you again to the university, maybe in a different forum, maybe a more focused discussion about curriculum and curriculum redesign, and really how to bring about transformation. But Bob, your work is absolutely fascinating, absolutely inspirational. Thank you for your time. Thank you to the participants for your time. Thanks for sticking around for 2.5 hours. And we'll be posting the recording of this presentation. And I wish you all very well. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to end the recording now, but if Professor Root-Bernstein would like to remain, for another 5 minutes for any other questions, you're most welcome to stay. But for now, I'm going to stop the recording. So can I ask if anyone would like to pose any final questions to Professor Bernstein, if he has time to actually entertain them?
Sure.